Get started. If you don't know me, my name is Jason Lawhorn. I'm the council person for District 5, recently elected in April, so I've been at it for 2 months or so. Just a real quick thing before we get started with the referendum, I do have a newsletter that goes out, so if you have not received that, you're interested in receiving that, you can make sure I have your email and I can get that out to you as soon as possible and put you on the mailing list for future ones. I wanted to thank everyone for coming out. It's absolutely beautiful out tonight, so I didn't know how many people were actually going to get inside here, so it's nice to see some people out here. Also wanted to thank staff. I know they're excited. This is their final time giving this presentation. They've been doing it quite a bit over the last few months, and I've seen it a few times. It's an outstanding presentation that really does give you a lot of good information, and it's very thorough about where the money goes, the difference between debt financing and pay-as-you-go options, I guess, what the projects are, and where that money's going, and why we need to do the project. So I'd highly encourage you to ask questions and make sure you don't leave here without understanding what those projects are, what it means when you answer those questions, and what that means to you, both as the city and the services it provides, and what it means to you financially. So I won't take up too much more time, and I'll hand it over to Acting City Manager Tom Coleman.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Just like Jason said, it's a very nice night out. Lots of other places you could be. I appreciate you coming here and spending time with us. So as Jason mentioned, this is the 9th of 9 town halls and the 11th time we've given this presentation. So we've been adding to it as we've moved through the process, so it's gotten a little longer. So this is probably going to be the longest one, but most of the questions I hope will be answered by the time we get to the end. So as Jason mentioned, my name is Tom Coleman. I'm the acting city manager for the city of Newark. Normally I'm the public works director. So tonight we're going to go over some of the more frequently asked questions that we've received about the referendum process and the projects that are included. We'll then provide an overview specifically of all the projects, and then we'll move into a financial discussion on why we think debt makes sense, and we'll review the available funding sources and our current and proposed debt service obligations. Then we'll finish up at the end with question and answers. So if you could wait to hold your questions to the end, I would appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it loud enough? All right, thank you. So tonight you'll hear from myself, Dave Del Grande, our finance director, and Tim Pulaski, our acting public works and water resources director. I apologize, Joe Spadafino is unable to make it tonight from the Parks Department, but we should be able to answer any parks-related questions you might have. So I figured it'd be best to start with the most basic question, and that's why are we proposing a referendum at all? So the short version is that we have a large number of infrastructure projects that need to be completed and not enough cash to pay for them, so we need to use debt. The city's charter outlines our power to incur debt, and more specifically, it covers the exact steps that we must follow in order to do so. Here in Newark, outside of a few very specific items, if we want to incur debt, we have to go to a referendum and get authorization from our residents. So it's important to point out that the referendum doesn't approve the project specifically. So all it does is it authorizes council to take on debt if they want to do those projects. So all of these projects will come back to council after we've moved forward and finalized the design, gone out to bid, got pricing, and got a full package together for council to authorize. Then they'll review the project again on its merits and whether or not they want to pay for it and move forward with the project and authorize at that time any funding sources at the interest rates that we've been able to work out with banks or the state revolving loan fund through the state. So historically, the city has used debt only a handful of times, most recently for the construction of the reservoir and upgrades at our South Wellfield water treatment plant in the early 2000s. Otherwise, we've paid for almost all of our capital projects using cash. So what are the questions that we'll be voting on? So compared to the last referendum, we're doing things a little differently this time. In the last referendum, there were 2 questions. Question 1 was on the reservoir, and question 2 was for upgrades at the water treatment plant. Since we have 14 projects that we're doing as part of this referendum, or that we're proposing to do as part of this referendum, we've broken them into 4 questions. Question 1 and 2 are both related to the purchase of the Rodney dormitory complex. and converting that to a stormwater pond for flood mitigation. And question 2 is additional parks amenities to go along with that. So the parks amenities are, walking paths, pavilions, a fishing pier, educational components, and an outdoor classroom, educational playground equipment, that sort of thing. So both of those would be financed through the state revolving loan fund at a interest rate that we've already locked in at 2%, should council decide to move forward. So question 3 includes all of our proposed water and sewer projects. And these are also proposed to be paid for using funding from the state revolving loan fund. But we have not yet locked in our financing there, so we're not sure what the interest rate is yet. The way that program works is the interest rate varies until you lock in prior to the project starting. Right now, the interest rate's in the 2 to 3% range for those programs. Question 4 covers all of our general fund and parking fund obligations. And will likely be financed through a bank loan or general obligation bonds. But Dave will go into detail on the funding sources later. So when you go to vote, each question will have 2 choices, either for or against issuance of the bond certificate of indebtedness. If you vote for it, you are agreeing to taking on debt. If you are against it, you do not want to authorize taking on debt. So here's a copy of the ballot that you'll see if you step into the voting booth on the 19th. You'll see there's 4 questions on the left, down the left side, and then each one has either for or against, and you can pick one. So we'll go. Tim will be going over all the projects in a lot of detail when we move on. So I'm going to move into the more of the frequently asked questions section now. So tonight you'll hear Dave and I and Tim reference the term capital when we're talking about spending and budgeting. So I wanted to start by providing the definition as stated in the City of Newark's charter. So our charter defines capital as any project or equipment, including any extension or addition thereto or thereof, having a life expectancy in excess of or to be financed over a period greater than 6 years or a value exceeding $20,000. All right, that's great, but what are some examples of capital? Bring that home. So for us, capital projects are usually things like you see here, infrastructure. The large majority of our capital spending is going to be on an item like this, mainly because they're very expensive, and like your house or your car, they need to be maintained or replaced periodically. So how much infrastructure do we have? A lot. So I'm going to walk through each of our utilities and give a quick overview so you get an idea of the scale. So we have the most water infrastructure by a large margin, and most of these items are quite expensive. For example, it costs us around $1.2 million to replace 1 mile of small diameter water main like what's in front of your house. In total, the replacement value of our water infrastructure is estimated at $200 million if we had to replace it all today. That's almost $6,000 of water infrastructure for every person resident of the city, and that's just the water system. We also have a lot of sewer infrastructure. The total replacement value for sewer is less than water because it can be rehabilitated a little more easily, often without digging up the street, but the value is still more than $67 million. Stormwater is even more than sewer at around $100 million. Stormwater is a little different in that we have different pipe materials with dramatically different expected lives to the point that we actually track them and handle them separately. The only type of pipe that we're really concerned about at the moment is corrugated metal pipe. We refer to it as CMP. And CMP lasts around 35 to 40 years. We have about 5 miles of it here in the city, and almost all 5 miles are at or beyond their expected life. The rest of our pipes reinforced concrete or high-density polyethylene, like that black plastic pipe that you can get from Home Depot, just a beefed-up version of that. And that has an expected life of around 100 years. So you can see 35 to 40 years or 100 years. There's a dramatic difference between the two of them. So in addition to our pipes, we have 65 city-maintained stormwater ponds and facilities, mostly in residential neighborhoods. So our electric infrastructure is made up of substations, lines, transformers, and our McKee solar facility off of Cleveland Avenue. We estimate the replacement value of the city's electric utility infrastructure to be at $50 million or more. So in addition to our traditional utilities, we also have parking infrastructure like our downtown parking lots, meters, et cetera. And with our parking infrastructure, they're treated much like a traditional utility. So the revenue that comes in from our parking fund is kept separate, and then we transfer a profit margin off of that utility into the general fund to help pay for general fund things like police, trash service, et cetera. So lastly, we have city-maintained streets, City Hall, police station, our parks, and other city-maintained facilities. And this is the infrastructure that's supported by your taxes, fees, and those margin transfers that I mentioned that come in from the different utilities. In total, we estimate the current replacement value of our infrastructure and capital assets to be around $500 million. That's a huge number considering we're a city of just over 33,000 people. That means we have over $15,000 worth of infrastructure for every resident in the city. And the vast majority of it is underground, or at least out of sight and out of mind, and easy to forget about until you hit a pothole or the lights won't come on or your toilet won't flush. So while it's helpful to know how much of everything we have, it's even better to know what condition is it in so we can plan. So what is the condition of our infrastructure? I'm going to go through each type in the same order, and you'll see that we have different levels of information on each one. Starting with water, I'm going to focus on mains first because they make up the majority of the water system's assets. So getting good condition assessment on water mains is difficult because they're under pressure and they have to remain in service at all times. So you can't go in and take a look at the inside very easily. So we've begun piloting some technologies that lets us indirectly measure the remaining life of a pipe from the outside, but they're still pretty new and expensive, so widespread implementation hasn't happened yet. So in the meantime, we use a combination of our water main break history, water quality complaints, the pipe's age, the pipe's material, and industry guidelines to estimate the remaining service life to prioritize replacement. As I'll show in the next few slides, a lot of our water mains are going to hit or exceed their expected lifespan and expire in the near future. But it's important to point out that when a pipe expires, it doesn't stop working all of a sudden. But I'll get into that a little more later. So this is what we like to refer to as the bathtub diagram, and it shows the general failure pattern for pipes. So you often get a quick round of failures right at the beginning on the left side, as right after a pipe goes in, and any of the manufacturing defects or installation defects will fail early and quick. And then after you get through that initial round, you'll see a nice constant rate where you might get a break every 15, 20 years. And then as the pipe gets near or beyond expiration, the break rate will ramp up as it wears out. So the expected life for a pipe depends on a few things: the manufacturing methodology, the material itself, and how it was installed, the soil it was installed in. And generally, the longer the material's life, the longer you have in that constant failure phase. So with water mains, generally, the older the main, the longer the expected life. So it's a little backwards, but essentially back in the 1800s and early 1900s, they didn't have the best manufacturing technology, so they couldn't manufacture to tight tolerance. So they would just make things extra thick. So like our water main on Main Street, we have a sample of over there on the table. You'll see it's about an inch thick if you go over and look at it. It's really thick water main. And that was put in the 1800s. So mains put in kind of late 1800s up to 1930 have an expected life of 100 to 120 years. Water mains that were put in from the 1930s on until very recently, the last few years, have a lifespan of anywhere from as low as 55 years to 100 years, depending on the soil that they were buried in and the like, because they started manufacturing them very thin, because they were able to manufacture them to the thickness that is required to hold the pressure, not necessarily the thickness that was required to manufacture it. So the mains that we've installed since 2016 are back up consistently above 100 years because we're using different installation techniques, and we're actually, believe it or not, wrapping the pipe in almost like a plastic bag, a heavy-duty plastic bag that keeps the soil off the outside of the pipe, and the soil is what causes a lot of the corrosion issues and most failures in metal water pipe. So this is what I mentioned earlier about how a pipe expires. So on this slide, the green line, which is this one here, represents the cost to operate an existing pipe. Now, think about that bathtub diagram. Assume there's a long flat one here, and then it kind of went up at the start. So this is getting near where it wears out. So the cost to operate the pipe gets higher as you have more main break failures and the crews are going out, digging up the road, fixing the pipe, people are without water, businesses are without water, et cetera. At a certain point, the cost to operate that pipe gets higher than the debt service you would pay to put in a new one, and that's this blue line here. You know, if it costs $10,000 a year in debt service to replace that pipe, once you've had, on that segment, it would be more than one break a year, it would be more costly to maintain the existing pipe than to replace the old one. So where that optimal replacement, where the two lines cross and it becomes cheaper to put in a new pipe than to take care of the old pipe, where that lands varies street to street, main to main. So if you've got a pipe that's out in the middle of a field and you can dig up, doesn't impact anyone, doesn't take any customers out of service, well, you can let that pipe break all the time because it's not that big of a deal to fix. If you've got a water main that's near a hospital or in your downtown in a main road or an intersection, those ones they are very expensive to repair. They knock a lot of customers out. So those are the ones that you're going to want to replace earlier before they start to fail often. So right now we're working to develop an accurate estimate for the remaining service life for all 140 miles of our pipe, but that's going to take some time. For the sake of this presentation, we're going to show you information using recommendations from the American Water Works Association, which is kind of the industry group for water systems. And their guidance is to assume 70 years for an average pipe in your system. And we feel that based off the breaks that we're experiencing in town, it's going to be generally accurate enough for this purpose at least. So you can't see that at all. All right, I was afraid of that. Thanks. I'm just going to skip to the next slide because it's got the same information in a different form. But what we've done here is we've taken the pipes in our system, we've broken them into groupings. So each one of these bars is a 5-year period. So the top bar is pipes that are already expired. And in our system, we have 15 miles of pipe that's already at or beyond its expected life. That's 12% of the system. In the next 5 years, another 12 miles are going to pass into that expired category. And then by the end of the next 15 years, a total of 74 miles of our water mains are going to be past their expiration, beyond their expected service life, if we don't start replacing more water mains. So if we continue at our current rate and replace about a mile a year, that's been our target recently. We've been getting close to it. We haven't actually gotten there very often, but if we do our target of a mile a year, 15 years from now, 59 miles of our system are still going to be in that expired category, and that's 42% of the system. And that doesn't, the 140 miles of water mains that I referenced earlier and was on the slide, that's just our distribution system. So we have more pipes on the back side of our treatment plants that carry untreated water. So our total mileage is even higher. So based on a recent study, so since the first meeting, this is new information for Jason because I know he was at the first meeting, a study's come out of Utah State University on water main failure rates. And in that study, the nationwide average for pipes that are in that expired category is 16%. So we're at 12%, so we're doing a little better than the nationwide average right now. But that's going to change pretty considerably in the next 15 years, as you can see there. So nationally, the percentage of expired pipes has doubled since 2012. So in 2012 it was 8%, now it's 16%. So a lot of the country is seeing the same thing happen. And the break rate for cast iron pipe, which makes up a large portion of our system, probably more than any other material, has increased 46% over those same 6 years. So it's a problem that's accelerating. So what does this mean for Newark? So it means we should plan to have more water main breaks and interruptions in service. So here we've charted the number of water main breaks going back every year until to 1977, which was the first year that we have on record where we kept records for main breaks. You can see there's a definite trend up through the years. So each one of these breaks is generally accompanied by a service outage and occasionally a boil water order, which can last 24 to 48 hours. These outages have a negative effect on the quality of life, and if they're near a business, on their revenue. Like I said earlier, they don't stop working altogether, they just stop working very well. I guess going back to this slide, since I skipped one earlier, so the reason we don't see an even distribution here is that one in 10 to 15 years, that's really an echo of the development boom after World War II. So people came back in the early 50s, and they developed a lot of the area out, like Nottingham, Windy Hills. A lot of those neighborhoods were built right around the same time, and all that pipe is coming due in that kind of 10 to 15 year out line there. So moving on from water mains. So starting around 2011, the city began increasing our water rates from the kind of artificially low rate that was in place prior to them. And this allowed for a capital project initiative where we ramped up our spending on capital and started to address some of our deferred maintenance. While water mains make up the majority of the water's infrastructure, the other water facilities have a much shorter life, so they need to be replaced more often. Because of that, they kind of punch above their weight from a budget perspective. So we've been really busy over the last 7 years, and we've completed over $17 million in water fund capital projects. So we have 2 water treatment plant projects that we have underway or will be completed by the end of the year. One, we just recently finished our South Wellfield water treatment plant, which was to replace our existing pH adjustment system. And then we have our second project is at our surface water treatment plant on the White Clay Creek to convert from gas chlorine for disinfection to a liquid system that's much safer, rehab the roof, rehab the walls. That building is about 30 years old, or I guess a little over 30 years old, so things are wearing out there. So that will be completed ideally by the end of 2018. On the sewer side, we've been working to inspect and develop a prioritization for our rehab work. So far we've inspected about 15% of the sewer system, and we've identified around $4 million worth of high priority repairs. So we began making many of the repairs during 2017. We actually have a contract that's underway right now, and should be wrapped up by the end of the summer, I would expect. So since 2011, we've spent nearly $4 million on sewer capital projects, and we've also rebuilt all of our sewer pump stations. So the way a sewer system works is by gravity, largely. So it flows downhill, the pipes get deeper and deeper and deeper until they get too deep. Then you put in a pump station that lifts it up, usually pumps it over a hill or something, and then it flows downhill by gravity again. So in Newark, we have three major pump stations, and they've all been rebuilt since 2011. On the stormwater side, like I mentioned earlier, we've been focused on corrugated metal pipe because it has that shorter service life. Since starting in 2016, we completed a citywide condition assessment and did closed circuit television inspection, where we actually send like a robot up the pipe with a camera on it and inspect the inside of all 5 miles of that pipe. After the inspection, we reviewed and prioritized all the lines, and we identified about $3.5 million worth of repairs that we'll need to complete in the next 10 years or so. So as many of you may or may not be aware, Council approved last year a stormwater utility that came into effect on January 1st of this year. Because of that, we have a stable funding source built in, and when we set the rate for that stormwater utility, it had all these projects included in that base rate. So we have the funding we need to do the next 5 years at least worth of corrugated metal pipe repair. So that's a great thing. But that rate was not set to be able to pay for the Rodney project because we weren't there yet on that project. So if Rodney's approved, as we'll discuss later tonight, it'll affect the average residential homeowner about $1 a month. For our road network, we have a full pavement management system where we complete an annual inspection of all the roads in the city that are city maintained. We rate them, and then we run them through an optimization program to try and develop an optimal project from a cost perspective. One of the outcomes from that is we ran a few scenarios of trying different spending levels. So what would it take to maintain all the city's streets at their current level so the average condition citywide doesn't decrease, just keeps it the same. And in order to do that, we need to be spending about $1.75 million a year in today's dollars. That's a number we've only been able to achieve one time since 2011. We came pretty close last year, within probably $50,000, but we didn't quite get there. Most years we've been closer to $1 million. In addition to that, we have about $1.5 million worth of parks capital maintenance scheduled over the next 5 years that needs to be completed. So how do we get ourselves into this situation? Well, using only cash limits our ability to tackle large projects because they crowd out smaller, less sexy projects and preventative maintenance. It's a lot more exciting to have a new ribbon cutting than it is to replace a pipe that's generally worked your whole life. Our water and sewer rates are also entirely consumption-based. So if you leave and go to Florida for a month, you'll come back and your water and sewer bill will be $0. You get it out of the mail, we mailed it to you. The pipes still had to be there the whole time. Our water plant still had to be there. If there's a fire, the fire company could still come and put the fire out in your house using water. So there are lots of benefits you get, but you literally pay $0. So where this gets us is, it means most of our revenue is dependent on the weather. So if it's cool and wet, we don't sell much water. Conversely, we don't sell much sewer, and it has a pretty severe impact on our revenue. So 80% of Newark's revenue comes from utilities, electric, water, sewer. So a huge portion of the city's revenue is dependent on the weather, because the same thing that applies to water and sewer applies to electric. So just in the water and sewer funds alone, over the last 3 years, we have underproduced revenue-wise $3 million because it's been kind of generally wetter than historically. So that's all money that could have been going towards infrastructure maintenance, but instead we had to cut other things, cut projects or push projects off. So this next one's probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone in the room, but about 50% of Newark's land area is tax exempt. And that puts us in a really deep hole when it comes to paying for our general fund services like police and trash. We fill that hole by transferring 20% or more of the gross revenue to our utilities into the general fund. The only one we don't is the stormwater fund. That's the one that we set up most recently. We think we got it right this time, where that one is lockbox. So any money that comes in from the stormwater utility cannot be transferred out to the general fund. Now, all those things said, the biggest issue is that we're entering the first round of the replacement era. Like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing the echoes of the post-World War II development boom. So historically, we have not had to pay for most of the infrastructure we have, or at least through our rates, because it was paid for by developers or the federal government through grants. So when new development's built in the city and everywhere else, really, the developer puts in the water mains, puts in the sewer mains, pays for the electric lines to be put in, and then you pay for that as a home buyer the first time you buy your house. But the water, sewer, and electric rates never had to pay for that infrastructure in the first place. So the rates are not set at a level that will be able to pay for that infrastructure. So even the mains that were installed for the city by a contractor or through a grant that we got directly were generally assessed against the property owners along that road frontage. So if you had 100 feet of road frontage, you were assessed 100 feet's worth of that project cost. So like I said, our tax and rate structure has never had to pay for any of this stuff before. And as it wears out, the revenue demands for our utilities are going to increase significantly over the next 20 years. So in addition to that, a large majority of Newark's been developed in an unsustainable development pattern, and that's suburban-style single-family homes. So if you live in a single-family detached home, I can almost guarantee you're not paying enough to cover the infrastructure necessary to support your house based on our current utility rate structure and tax levels. For example, if you live in a house with a 100-foot wide lot, your taxes need to support, in addition to police and trash and our code enforcement, the paving and maintenance of at least 50 feet of that road frontage, because you figure the neighbor across the road's got the other half. Same goes for your water, sewer, and electric infrastructure. So using our current cost for water main replacement, 50 feet of water main costs over $11,000 to replace. Assuming 10% of your water bill goes towards infrastructure, using an average water customer, it will take 300 years to pay for that 50 feet of water main, let alone all the other infrastructure like booster stations, water treatment plants, and that sort of thing. So fortunately, we have locations like our downtown, so that building, 58 East Main Street, where Qdoba and Honeygrow is. I ran the numbers for that building, and it will pay off its water main every 2 to 3 years. So we see a very similar pattern in our tax structure and basically all the utilities that use water as an example. So here's a map still in development that shows whether a property is paying enough in taxes to pay for just the general fund services it gets. Now, while it's not complete yet, the general idea and scope is not going to be significantly different once it is. So based on our preliminary estimates, all the parcels in red do not provide enough tax revenue to cover the cost of providing them with general fund services. So the median city tax bill, if you didn't know this, is $515. The cost for us to provide trash service to a house for a year is $300. So in the city, 20% of residents aren't paying enough in taxes to even pay for just the trash service that they get, let alone everything else. So parcels that have a positive value are shown in yellow, blue, and green, and the properties, and those are the properties that make up that difference for us. So what you can see in general is the single-family detached housing is negative, which means that if we were to approve a new single-family detached neighborhood today, it will make us as a community poorer than if we had done nothing at all. And that's an important takeaway. So I'm not trying to say, if you live in a condo, you should defriend all your friends and live in a single-family home or anything like that. That's not the intent. The intent is just to have a discussion about, where are we in our current situation, so we can make smarter decisions moving forward when development plans come through. We can make decisions with our eyes open and fiscally sound decisions. So, like I said, it's been a lot of doom and gloom up until now, but it's not all bad news, and I can tell you it's definitely not unique to Newark. So cities across the nation are facing the same problem, cities, towns, and states, believe it or not. So they're facing it whether they know it yet or not. For example, Illinois just determined they need to spend closer to $21 billion a year on infrastructure, when historically they've spent $3 billion. The state's entire budget is only $38 billion. So they need to add $17 billion to a $38 billion budget. They're not going to be able to do it. So you can see what kind of problem they're facing. Fortunately for us, we're in a lot better situation than them specifically, but a lot of our other peers for several reasons. Firstly, since 2011, or maybe a little before then, council has shown a real desire to tackle this problem and get in front of it. And that's reinforced by the fact that we're here today having this conversation. We also have a relatively compact city compared to our peers. So Dover, for example, has 2.5 times our land area and only 10% more people. So they're going to have to pay for, extrapolate out 2.5 times as much stuff with only 10% more people. So that they're in a much worse position than Newark is. So we're also in the very fortunate position of having the Star campus, a 270-acre blank slate on the south side of town that will be bringing all new revenue to the city. So you may or may not know this, but when Chrysler was there, they were a Delmarva Power customer. So we didn't sell them any electric. We did get tax revenue off of them, and they were at the time a United Water customer for most of the site, and then the Mopar parcel, which was a smaller parcel on this side, was City Water. So when the university bought Star Campus, they demoed the building, Delmarva went away, all that territory became City of Newark electric territory. So every project that goes back there will be new electric revenues that we've literally never had. At build out, using the university's current projections, the electric demand at Star Campus is going to be 60% of the entire electric demand for the city today. So that's all new sales that we've never had before that we'll be able to use to offset rising costs on our other utilities by keeping down the electric rates, or maybe even depressing them depending on how this builds out. In addition to that, any project that is built by someone that's not UD, so that's every building down there right now except the Biopharmaceutical Institute that's going up, will come back on the tax rolls. So we'll be getting tax revenue that we haven't had since the early 2000s. And all that revenue will be helped to keep costs down for our residents. So I'm glad everybody's seated for this one, if you haven't heard it, but the university's planning to add 4,000 grad students over the next 5 years and up to 1,500 undergraduates over the next 10 years. So the grad students are year-round young professional residents that are generally too busy studying to get in much trouble, but they're also generally going to be good neighbors. They'll be here to support our businesses over the summer months, over the winter break. And if we can provide them housing downtown near campus where their job is, they can walk to campus, they can bike to campus, they're not going to be driving around. We'll get the electric sales, tax revenue, utility sales without the problems like if they were living in Glasgow or in Christiana where they're driving into town. So the university is going to add the students one way or the other. So we can either accommodate them here somewhere where they can walk to campus, or we can push them out on the outskirts. We don't get any of the revenue from them, and they're going to drive in and clog our streets. So every 1% that we add to the tax base is 1% of revenue that can go towards supporting infrastructure that doesn't have to come from our current residents. So at this point, I'm going to have Tim come up and he'll go over all the projects that are included in the referendum. Before he begins, I do want to point out that all of the projects that we're about to discuss are included in the approved 5-year capital budget for the city, which can be found at these links. We've got some more links on the city's website, later in the presentation. All the information you'll get tonight is up on the city's website, newark.de.gov/vote. And this presentation will be there. The video from this presentation will likely be there. And you can get all sorts of information at that website. All right, so I'll hand it off to Tim.
So we have set up an email address, which will come up later in Tom's final comments. It is asknewark@newark.de.us. We set it up specifically for the referendum process, but we realized that would be a good portal for if you have a question or have a concern about the city. Send it to asknewark@newark.de.us. It'll go directly to our communications team, and they'll get it out to the proper person to get you an answer. So with that said, we'll go into question 1, which are stormwater projects in the same project, but split into 2 different parts. So hopefully many of you have heard or seen our proposal for purchasing the former Rodney dorms and demolishing them to make way for a stormwater management pond with parks amenities. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the city to acquire a piece of land well situated to help achieve stormwater quality and quantity improvements. This parcel sits at the top of a large drainage area where little to no stormwater controls exist. Managing stormwater near its source is a key benefit to downstream systems. The parcel is also situated in an area that lacks city-owned open space in close proximity to our award-winning Main Street. So one of our consultants actually brought it to our attention in the RFP process. They showed us a map that had a bullet on each of our parks, and there was a donut hole right, on downtown. So commercial properties are obviously expensive. So anybody that has property downtown probably wants to maximize their return on that. So this is an opportunity to look at that and say, let's get a park, closer to downtown that folks can enjoy. Sorry, I can't find my. Approximately 6,000 residents live within a 15-minute walk of this property, and nearly 2/3 of our residents live within a 10-minute bike ride of the site. A combination of the pond and park would address all these important issues, as well as serve as a showcase for our educational efforts to show residents and visitors how they can contribute to keeping our stormwater and ultimately drinking water for a number of folks in the in Newark and Newcastle County area, how we can keep that water clean. So Rodney, the question 1, as Tom said, there's 2 questions. One is for the purchase and development, and then the second question will be for the parks amenity. So although the project vision was to develop the pond and park together as complementary, we were able to break out the stormwater management needs from the aesthetically pleasing park amenities into 2 questions on the referendum. A yes vote on the Rodney question 1 would authorize council to borrow money from the state revolving loan fund, which Dave will discuss a little bit later, for the purchase of the property, the demolition and environmental remediation, pond construction, and some minor amenities to allow site accessibilities and to maintain the current pedestrian pathway from Dowlam Road. So if you look up in the top left, that's Dowlam Road. We would actually do an intersection analysis there to see if we can line those 2 areas up, and so you're still able to make the trip from Dowlam Road through the underpass out to South Main Street. Minor landscaping and pond edge treatments to enhance the safety and beauty of the area would also be included in this option. And the estimated cost associated with this question is about $6.5 million, and which Dave will explain a little bit later. Part of that is the fixed cost in the purchase from the university. A yes vote on Rodney question 2 would authorize council to borrow money from the state revolving loan fund to fund the majority of the park amenities that were discussed and chosen as part of a public workshops in the summer of 2017. Residents who participated in this discussion agreed that the passive recreation coupled with small classroom space and picnic areas was the best fit for the space. An accessible fishing pier was also included, but we don't anticipate needing to stock the pond. Most ponds generally end up with some fish in them by birds and other methods. So if it became so popular that we needed to, we could look into certainly stocking that. Extensive educational signage and elements would also be integrated into the site to show residents and visitors the role stormwater management plays in our ecosystem and our city. As Dave Del Grande will discuss, the funding for the park amenities through the revolving loan fund are locked at 2% through the state, and the approval is actually awaiting our signature. Funding these upgrades in future years with other sources of funding, other sources of revenue would cost more than the 2%. One quick question, one quick thing. It is important to remind everyone here, I don't know if anyone here actually came to any of our presentations we did when we were moving through the Rodney. We appreciate it, thank you. We did have a fairly robust group of folks come out to all three, and we selected these options based on the feedback that they gave. It was really interesting to see what everyone wanted to see there, and then you end up with, you have several different questions, and then when everybody's answers go up on the board, you can clearly see that what people wanted. Beer garden showed up, but currently we can't have alcohol in parks, so trails and stormwater management became were the top two. So as you can see here, we anticipate several walking trails and paths and passive recreation open space. So this slide lists the projects contemplated for our water utility. Several of these projects, as Tom mentioned, are not every 100 years, but every 10 to 20 years, and they tend to crowd out the smaller jobs or to be pushed out due to the lack of available cash. Each year, if we have $4 million to do capital projects within the city, and we have a $10 million water treatment plant upgrade to complete, obviously that can't get done in any one given year, and we would have to spread that out. And even if we were able to complete that in 1 year, no other projects would be able to be completed simply because all the cash is gone. Dave will elaborate on the need for debt a little bit later. So I'm going to get into the individual projects and a little detail on why each one is important to maintaining our water utility. The Lair Track well field restoration is actually a new project on some old wells. We anticipate that it would nearly double our drought resiliency and bring back some production that was furloughed when the reservoir came online. So all these wells used to pump directly into the system, and because they're high iron and manganese content, we weren't able to pump those into the system anymore once we had the treatment plant online. So now having the reservoir online, we're able to, we believe we can pump these wells directly into the reservoir and then allow the aeration in the reservoir to take care of some of the treatment for us, and then bring that down to our treatment plant and treat the water and send it out. So these wells are protected, mostly within the White Clay Creek State Park and bordering on some lands that are owned by the University of Delaware that are generally wooded and generally not subject to either residential development or industrial commercial development. And generally some of the most protected areas of the city, if not in the state, due to the White Clay Creek's status as a wild and scenic river. So luckily somebody came up with an acronym for this one. This is called SCADA, or Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It's an ongoing project which essentially allows us to be in 2 or more places at one time. We are able to monitor system data, track real-time levels and production, and make changes remotely if possible. So at any given time, we have one water treatment plant operator on 24 hours a day. With our 2 treatment plants and water tanks and pumps, they can't be everywhere at once. So this is actually a screenshot from the computer. It's a little difficult to see, but this shows the Levere's water tank there, the white dome there. That's the Levere's water tank. It shows the 2 pumps and then the tank that actually feeds that tank. So we can look at that at any given time and see which pumps are running and see the levels in the tanks, and actually we're able to run these pumps based on the levels that are in the tanks and make these changes remotely if there is an issue at any given time. So you can kind of see here in the bottom 2 pictures. This is a picture of our. This is the rehabilitated treatment plant. As Tom likes to point out, I had a better beard at the time there. You can see it's a little bit longer. But this was when this was just completed about 1.5 years ago, and it was just a cosmetic update to the tank and piping system. But many of you may be aware that the groundwater underneath of our South Wellfield treatment plant was recently listed on the EPA's National Register, or is more commonly known as Superfund site. The good news is that the contaminants that they found in the water are easily treatable by our current system. However, the current system is nearing the end of its useful life and it needs to be replaced. We've also experienced we had to take some supply offline because we can't treat the amount of water and the amount of contaminants that are coming through. So we've had to reduce the amount that we actually treat. A new system, it's called an air stripper, so the new system would be able to treat more water and get more capacity back in that facility. So other modern upgrades are being vetted for inclusion in the facility upgrade as well. And just so everyone is aware, it still meets federal and state drinking standards. There's and for our clean water here in Newark. So our water main replacement, these 2 pieces of pipe are actually over on the table. This is an older pipe, and it doesn't show up as well. I can show you some of the degradation to the pipe itself, and then that is actually just a small section of a new pipe. Years ago, and this is actually the plastic that Tom mentioned. The pipe is is a black pipe in there, and then there's white plastic around it that keeps the soil from touching the pipe and keeps the soil from corroding the pipe. So the old pipe did not have a cement liner, and the new pipe on the top does have a cement liner that keeps the water from reacting with the inside of the pipe and causing the tuberculation that you see in the pipe, and you can see it firsthand over here. So we do know, as Tom mentioned, that we need a system-wide study. The system-wide studies are not easy, and they're not inexpensive. However, we do have enough information now to target and fix the worst of what we know in this 5-year CIP cycle. And as you can also see on there, as Tom mentioned, it requires a large road restoration, which is a large part of the cost. It should be noted that we have better coordination now with the annual paving program, so that years ago we would go in and put a water line in, and then we would go in and pave a street and then come back 2 years later and put a water line in. I'm not going to tell you that won't ever happen again if we find out that a pipe is really bad, but we've made concerted efforts to kind of stem that and make each project a little cheaper by coordinating the 2. Water tank rehabilitation. This is the Windy Hills water tower. You can see here, and we tried to get the same day before and after, and we got close. So you can see that it's in much better shape. This tank actually did have a lead coating, which we have 5 other tanks, not including this one, that also have a lead coating. It's important to note that the lead is on the outside, not on the inside. So the water doesn't touch the lead, it's just the coating on the outside. The state is beginning to draft legislation on the methods of removal for lead paint, and we're exploring options instead of actually blasting the lead based paint off, to just simply remove the tanks and replace them with a new tank. The cost is somewhere similar. We're still evaluating that, but if it's cheaper and we can get a a longer lifespan out of some of these tanks, then we're going to go ahead and go with the full replacement. If we do end up painting, we have our specifications drafted to reflect state regulations, and that will be in place before we begin any of this work. So also included in question 3 are some of our sewer projects. And our sewer projects, essentially it's one project and several different steps in the rehabilitation process. As Tom mentioned, the first step is to identify the critical lines and perform inspections using the closed circuit television, or CCTV. The CCTV inspections are then reviewed, and the defects in the pipes are prioritized in a report that we utilize to group the projects for similar rehabilitation methods. There are some pipes that simply need a small repair in maybe a 10-foot section of pipe that's collapsed. Others have roots growing in them, and they need to have the roots cleaned. And then what we do is we put a liner in most of these things. As Tom mentioned, most of these are fairly deep, and that way we would have to have a huge excavation to actually get down to them, and then we would have to put the road all back together. So what we do is we actually put a sock, essentially, into the pipe, and then expand that with either steam, hot water, or a UV light. And then it cures in the pipe and essentially makes a new pipe inside of the pipe, and extends the life of the pipe by 50 to 75 years. So as Tom mentioned, they are deeper, and we end up lining more than we do dig up and replace. So again, we've identified about $4 million worth of the work that needs to be done on what we've inspected, and we're continuing to do inspections ahead of major repaving projects. If you drive down Main Street or Delaware Avenue tonight, you'll probably see a crew out doing some of these CCTV videos ahead of the Main Street and Delaware Avenue paving in the next few years. Question 4 deals with our general fund projects. And these are included in the proposed debt financing simply because many of these projects are necessary for the operation of the city, yet they always seem to get a lower priority than utilities and the other projects. Our ADA transition plan has been in place since about 2008 and utilizes the city funds as well as federal block grants in order to upgrade the handicapped accessibility and transportation routes to comply with the current ADA standards. We've replaced nearly 1,400 of the 1,800 existing ramps, as well as upgraded many city-owned facilities, including this facility here and City Hall. So we have about 10 years left to get all of the current ramps up to federal standards, but I always like to mention that since they're federal standards, as soon as we get done meeting them, they'll probably change them, and we'll have to start over again. So this program will probably stay in place for the foreseeable future. Hard surface improvements is basically our parks, tennis courts and basketball courts and trails and access to, bless you, and access to those facilities. So our park system is very well used. If you don't know, the Hall Trail and the Pomeroy Trail, and just recently the Reservoir Trail are in the top 3 used trails in the state of Delaware. So we certainly understand that folks like to use these trails, and eventually they're going to need maintenance. So we need to certainly look forward to that and budget for that. Where possible, again, we piggyback these projects on our annual street contract in order to secure better pricing. Most of the time they can come and do the tennis court or a parking lot for a park at the same time they do the street program. So if you notice out here, the parking lot is all brand new. They just did that about 2 weeks ago, and then they moved over to Apple Road to finish up Apple Road. And then next week they'll actually be on Academy Street. So it's all one project, but Parks pays for a little bit, we pay for a little bit. So we like to work together to make sure we get the best pricing. And last but not least, our field operations complex is where we store all of our equipment and material used for maintaining the streets, water lines, parks, and sewers that we have already discussed. We lack adequate storage space to keep this very expensive equipment out of the weather. And I said that exact same thing if you watch the sewer video on YouTube later. So, but I said it within a building that didn't look so hot. So phase one of this project was to build a new salt shed, which was completed in 2016 and allowed us to have enough salt storage for an entire year's worth of snow events. We used to have to go down to the dock, to the Port of Wilmington and fight DelDOT and other municipalities to get a truckload of salt. DelDOT usually, bounced us out, but now we have, we put enough in the salt shed to last us all year, and we never have to go through. Fingers crossed, we don't have to resupply halfway through. So phase two will demolish a warehouse which is partially collapsed and replace it with a more functional system to keep this equipment out of the weather. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave Del Grande, and he's going to discuss why we're looking to finance using debt and why it's advantageous for municipalities to do so.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, everybody. I feel like you should all get a prize for being our last class tonight. I wanted to have our 10th meeting as maybe a Newark night at the park showing this, but it got beat up by Incredibles 2. I can understand why sometimes. But why are we doing debt? And which is basically the whole reason for everything here. So the city has used cash historically to fund the majority of our capital needs. And debt financing, it accomplishes two goals. One is that it fairly allocates the cost of the project over its useful life, and which allows everyone to pay their fair share of the cost of the project over the time that asset is in use. The other is that long-term debt has a minimal impact on our annual budget, and thereby keeping the city's annual revenue requirements as low as possible. Low needs in revenue translates directly into lower utility and tax rates and the fees that the city has to charge for the services we provide to everyone. So there's three funding sources that we've been talking about tonight. Going with the state revolving loan, the bond issuance, and your standard loan that everyone's accustomed to. So starting with the state revolving loan, it's the program that's most of the advantageous method for us to finance all of our water-related projects. And due to its federal support, the state is able to offer low-interest loans on a competitive basis to all government agencies within the state of Delaware. The low interest and closing costs associated with these loans make it very attractive for us, especially when the rates in the bond market begin to rise. As you know, yesterday that the Fed Reserve raised the rates again another 25 basis points. Another advantage to the program is that it provides flexibility with interest-only loans during the construction phase. And that allows us to provide budget relief to the agencies that are benefiting from the program, which would be us in this case. Our involvement in the program will also make us eligible in the future for grants for our water, sewer, and stormwater projects that we previously didn't have access to. Because this is a federally funded program, about $40 million a year goes into all four aspects of this state program. The state's able to then in return have competitive-based loans that are low interest. One being the Rodney project, for example. We put a application in for $9 million, which we were approved at a low rate of 2%, which is below the standard that they offer on these loans on a traditional basis. By offering low interest rates, it then has a lower cost for us in the payment terms. And the best piece is because it's part of the state revolving program, all the interest that goes back into this program then comes back out to other agencies in the state of Delaware to compete for grants and so forth. So all the interest that we're paying on these loans could come back to us, if not more, through grants in future years to support our sewer, water, and stormwater projects. So if we're not approved for a state revolving loan, our fallback plan would be to go to the bond market or with a bank loan. So the bond market route is the most costly, but provides a lower interest rate than a traditional bank loan. Even with higher fees, a bond authorization is generally the least expensive once we factor in the interest rates when we're comparing it to a bank loan itself. Bond funding becomes more attractive when we begin borrowing amounts over $10 million, since the fees associated with bond funding remain relatively fixed regardless of how much we're borrowing. So the city, we currently have bond ratings of AA+ from Fitch and AA2 from Moody's Investor Services, and part of the expense of going to the bond market is being reaffirmed by these rating agencies, so our bonds can be sold on the market. Typically, a bond authorization, last time we went in 2011, it was about $110,000 to borrow for refinancing the reservoir. Lastly, a bank loan is what many of us are familiar with. It's just a traditional loan going to our local bank. And although they generally carry an interest rate that's a little bit higher than the bond market, they don't have the high fees associated with them. So if we're talking about borrowing a small amount of money, say $3 million, for example, it may behoove us to go with the standard bank loan versus spending the additional fees and going through the bond market for a bond authorization. Here we are today. This is our current outstanding loan obligation. As of 12/31/17, we had a balance of about $15 million on our outstanding debt. So the green bar here that you see represents our reservoir in the South Well Field, the bond refi we did in 2011 for those. And 1.3 million of our annual debt service payments through 2022 account for the reservoir itself. And then the next largest piece of our debt service is the automated meter infrastructure project, or what we call the smart meters. And that's the blue bar that you see running across the bottom. So that's broken down into two different loans, and part of it is falling off in 2022, and then the rest will carry out of about $750,000 into 2028. So you can see there's a window of opportunity happening after 2022 for us. Here in another visual is just ultimately, these are all the state revolving loan projects that we have intended to use, and then how much money we need to borrow in 18 through 2022. The top one, as I mentioned, Rodney, has already been approved through the state revolving loan program, which is also, I had failed to mention, is pretty remarkable. Ultimately, the state does not generally approve projects of this magnitude prior to any successful referendum happening locally. But the state felt that this project was worthy enough to authorize approval prior to the actual referendum itself. So all the state's waiting for now is just a successful referendum decision, and then that $9 million would be eligible for us. If it doesn't happen and it were to fail, the $9 million goes back to the pool, and then someone else would be eligible for that low interest rate. All the other projects that are listed above, we have notice of intents in with the state, and we're confident that we would qualify through these programs for state revolving loans for the rest of these projects as well. And here is the general funded items that we had mentioned previously, which amount to about $3 million in total. So this is what we're looking like if we stack our current obligations on top of our proposed referendum, if everything were to pass as it sits today. This obligation would allow us to allocate the costs over the next 20 plus years in order to share the costs equitably and fairly across the board. So our current debt service, as you see, is the green, which is about $2.7 million in 18. The green tails off, as you can see, back into 2028 and 2029, but then the new debt that we will be incurring with the referendum would be stacked onto those periods. So our goal here is ultimately to incorporate a fixed amount of our budget every year in debt service or capital needs where we're using cash. So about $3 million is roughly just over 3% of our annual revenue budget. And if we were to stay between 3 and 4% a year annually to cover debt service needs, that would allow us to do a lot more projects here in the city without having a large burden on today's taxpayers. Ultimately, as I get into the next slide, you'll see what happens when we start showing what the pay-as-you-go method that we have been using and the impact it has on your wallets and today's residents. So we're trying to smooth out this whole thing, and I've gotten pretty good at the Jenga with my kids and all. That little triangle that peaks up there is the completion of the Rodney project, assuming that happens. And just based on timing, that chart could be smoothed out a little bit for a minimal impact on everyone today. So this is what it would look like based on how we're doing things today. It's a little jagged, and our $2.7 million debt service payment that we have in 18 looks dramatically different in the upcoming immediate years, over the next 4 years or so. But then it does tail off in 2023, pretty much back down to below what we are today at $750,000. Our goal is ultimately to make everyone comfortable in that $3 million range. If we were to continue with that perspective going out, we wouldn't have the need to raise almost over $12 million in 1 year. For comparisons, I'd mentioned we have a $87 million budget today. The referendum authorization is $27 million. So for us, that's a good percentage of our total revenue that we bring in on an annual basis. Even if you divide the 27 and 3 and say roughly it's $9 million a year, that's still a large portion that we have to come up with 10% increases year over year in the immediate term. So on this chart, orange is the Rodney project, all in, questions 1 and 2 of the $9 million using cash. And the water and sewer projects, question 3, is the dark blue towards the middle. And in the dead middle is the general fund items that we have, the half dozen to 8 projects or so to equal to $3 million. So as you can see, it makes my job harder, and I'm not sure how career enhancing it would be on my end, coming to council every year with a budget trying to find $10 million more than the previous year. All right, so this is where the rubber is starting to meet the road. So assuming no other fees were changed, what would our estimated tax and utility rates look like if we continued with these projects? The top box represents cash financing, which is the current pay-as-you-go method that we've been using. So using the top box in percentages, going out in 19, assuming that you are a customer of water, sewer, stormwater, electric, and taxes, you would see about a 12.7% increase in total just for the referendum items that we had talked about. This has no other, this does not include the rest of the city's budget. This is just strictly these projects. So moving out into 2020, rates will go up another 2% in total. But then in 21 and 22, you will get a little bit of relief seeing the rates come down 7% and then 6% back down to what they are today. Going with the debt financing option of borrowing, going in 19, there's a total of about a 1% increase on your total bills that you write to the city. The biggest portion of that is a stormwater pond. You would see a 36.9% increase, but that's the equivalent of $1 on your stormwater bill, just to give you an idea. Going out in 20, 21, and 22, you're seeing between a 0.4% and a 0.8% increase. So what this shows ultimately is the incremental differences going year to year are actually less than cost of living has been for the past few years. April of this year was 1.4%, and we're actually borrowing money less than the increase of cost of living. So it's cheaper for us to do these projects today versus to hold and wait and do them down the road. So percentages are great, but what do the dollar signs look like? Here we go. At the top, sticking with the cash piece, the average city resident is spending about $276 a month for taxes, water, sewer, the whole 9 yards. If we were to go with the cash method, we would have to ask for another $35 a month from everybody, all the residents in the city. In 2020, we would ask for another $6.20 more. But in 21 and 22, there would be relief, and those numbers will go back down to the 18 rates. Again, solely based on the $27.6 million we have to talk about this evening. And borrowing, your $276 will go up $2.70 a month. In 2020, it will go up another $1.46 in 21, and $2.33 in 22. And that number will stay there until the debt is paid off going outwards. So what's happening is those sitting in this room today and everyone else here living and doing business here today, using the top model, would ultimately be paying for all these projects today. Those who haven't moved here yet, those who will be moving here, my children, hopefully when they move out of my house, will be Newark residents, and they'll have their own bills to pay. And their water bill will go up and mine will go down because they have their own house. So they're going to be paying part of this. And ultimately, it just comes down to a matter of equity and fairness. I feel it's not fair to have all you covering the cost of Rodney over the next 3 years. I would much rather share a cost of something with a 50-year useful life amongst those who are going to be living here and using those assets over that period. So matching up a state revolving loan, which with all these water and sewer and stormwater projects, we're borrowing money at a rate that's actually less than CPI, and we're getting interest back we're getting grants back on the interest that we're paying into this loan. So conceivably, we can get more back than what we're paying. If this revolving loan program was coming from a bank, they would be insolvent right now and they would no longer be in business. But and since these state revolving loan programs are competitively based, if we don't apply for this money, it will go to somebody else. So the state is very eager for us to participate, and we've been very eager with them to dot all the I's and cross the T's that are as necessary to get us to this point. It's just a matter now of coming down to referendum and seeing what the public and our business owners like from this project. So ultimately, this referendum also often gets confused with a referendum that most people realize and come to know from school districts. All this referendum is doing is giving City Council the approval to borrow up to $27.6 million. It's not saying the council will borrow the full $27.6. It's just saying you as a community agree with this process, and for us to use debt to finance projects that are related to water, sewer, and stormwater and general fund items. So using that $27 million in these numbers, this is what we're looking at on the impact on your pocketbooks on an estimated base. So as I touched on, there are plenty of advantages to being part of the state revolving loan program. So one is the asset management is a practice of managing our capital infrastructure to minimize the cost of ownership and operations. So as Tom had said, we're starting to get into the beginnings of what we know that we have to do next year, this year, and 50 years from now. There's a program that the state has to help us with that. And by being in the state, having a state revolving loan, they actually have matching grants, planning advances, and those types of things to pay for the stuff that we were going to do anyway. So those capital projects won't have to come out of your pockets later on. And continuing on, there's water quality improvement projects, there's drinking water projects, matching planning grants, and so forth that all come back to us. Perhaps my favorite one is the low-income assistance program. What happens here is every year the city will be eligible to receive up to $200,000 for just the water and for sewer funds to help low-income residents in the city with their water and sewer bills. So as we mentioned earlier, since all of our water and sewer bills are based solely on consumption, as the city starts moving towards utility changes, we have programs in place that would help with the low-income folks in the city to help minimize the impact on their pocketbooks. So combined, we can get up to $400,000 a year from these programs, which is probably double than what we would be paying in interest for these loans. So we get more money coming back to us than we're actually paying into it, which is a tremendous program. But at this point, I will kick it back to Mr. Coleman. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dave. So when we started this process, like I mentioned at the beginning, our charter outlines the steps that we have to follow to take on debt, and one of those is having a referendum, and it actually outlines very specifically the timeline that you have to follow. So we're all the way through to June 19th, the black one in the middle, that's the referendum, that's Tuesday. Polls open at 7, close at 7 a.m., close at 8 p.m. After that, once we get the results back, the election board and council both have to certify the results. But assuming that everything moves forward and the projects are approved, following July 9th, we would work to, in accordance with the schedule that we've proposed for when projects would start, we'd start to develop the final engineering plans, put the projects out to bid, get those results back and bring them to council. So one thing I failed to mention earlier, for these questions that have multiple projects, since all you are doing is voting for or against authorizing the borrowing, and those projects have to come back to council. If there's a single project in there that you don't like, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can still vote for it and then notify your council person, Councilman Lawhorn or Clifton's in the back, that I voted for the whole, but I don't like that one, and I don't think you should approve that one. You still have that option available to you. So if the referendum fails in general or for a specific item, We'll have to work with council to reconsider the capital budget and whether or not we can delay any of these projects somehow, maybe do some patchwork to push them out a year or two to save up more money, maybe raise some rates. And that's a weird thing about the referendum process in Newark is the council does not, they could increase taxes 100% tomorrow or with the budget and not ask you at all. They wouldn't come back the next year. But in order to borrow, it has to go to a referendum. So it's a weird system here in Newark with that regard. So in summary, just to repeat the questions that are included in the referendum. Question 1 is the Rodney purchase of the facility, the property, demolition of the buildings, environmental remediation of the site, and construction of the pond with kind of the one trail through. It's important to point out it will be a park either way, either question 1 or question 2. It's going to be a park. You'll have access to the whole property. It'll just be a different park. So question 2 is all the park amenities and the educational components. So part of our contract with the university is that we're actually obligated to work with them on educational aspects, which actually works out really well because one of our requirements through the EPA's National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NPDES permit, is that we do education to teach people what they can do to keep the water clean and help our environment. So by having this facility and an agreement in place with the university where we will have educational programming at the facility is a plus for that. So question 3 is all the water and sewer projects, and question 4 is our general fund and parking fund projects. So as I mentioned earlier, we're putting all this information up on the city's website at the above address, the newarkde.gov/vote. We've also created an email address. We created it specifically for this effort. It's asknewark@newark.de.us. But we will keep that email address open into the future. That's going to be the city's general email. So if you have a question, it doesn't matter what it is, you can send it to that email address and our communications team will get it to the right person and get you an answer. We've also developed a frequently asked questions document. We've tried to address most of them here, but we didn't get to all of them. So if you think of something after you leave that you don't get answered during the Q&A session and it's keeping you up at night, you can go to the website, you can check that FAQ and the answer may be there for you. So at this time I'd like to thank everybody for coming out again and open it up to any questions. Yes, sir.
If it's not, the referendum is not approved, the Rodney Square, you would still work to find a way to buy that property and develop it, or something else would happen to it?
Okay, yeah. So the question was, if the referendum fails, what happens with the Rodney property? So we have a few options available to us. So in our contract with UD, we have built in where we could buy it with installment payments over 6 years. $350,000 a year over 6 years, we'll buy the site. So the way our contract is, the purchase price is $2.1 million, and then we can subtract up to $700,000. I'm going to get away from the speaker before it reverbs. We can subtract up to $700,000 of the demolition costs. So the net cost of the city is only $1.4 million. Now, if we buy this installment route, we won't have the money to demo the buildings or do any of the construction. So we're going to have to pay the full $2.1 million, at least initially, until we can save up enough money to do the demolition. Then we'll be able to apply for a refund, basically, from the university. So there is that option. So we have a way to buy it. It'll just make it a much longer-term project. If council decides that that's not a route they want to go, and we tell UD, thanks for the offer, thanks for working with us, but it's just not something we're going to pursue now. The underlying zoning, so I didn't touch on this earlier, but the University of Delaware is exempt from zoning. So since it's currently a university property, they could build literally anything they want there. They could take it down, they could put the Christiana Towers on that site, and there's nothing we could do about it. Which is the other reason why it's good for the university not to build the housing for their students and for us to let private developers do it instead, because we have a say over what gets built where if the private developer is building versus the university, and we'll get taxes from it. But circling back to this, so the current zoning is UN, which it means they can do whatever they want. If they sell it to someone else, like the Dickinson property, so they are under contract with someone, they haven't announced who it is yet, for that property. When it changes hands into that other property owner, it will revert to a zoning that's not university. In this case, it's RM, which is garden apartments, 16 units per acre. So Rodney and Dickinson are both RM. So at Rodney, it'd be around a capacity of around 110 units. Based off what I've heard, rumors, likely it's going to be student housing. That's what's been built recently. That's what most of the demand is, and I think that's what the highest profit margin is for developers, so that's what they're building. So that would be the likely end result. Now, potentially, could we try and renegotiate some other deal with the university? Maybe, but it's hard to say at this point. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is the university giving anything to the city here?
Thank you.
Is there any skin in the game from the university's point of view?
So the question was, is the university giving us any, or is there any skin in the game on their end? So
Because I think they're getting a lot of benefit from this.
yeah, so they are getting some benefit from this. So the Dickinson property we know has sold for north of $8.8 million. So they sold us the Rodney parcel for effectively 1.4. So
Same size?
yeah, Dickinson is marginally larger. It's like 8.4 acres, something like that, and Rodney's 7.6, but it's also closer and kind of a more conducive shape to development. So we think we got the better of the two properties at a price that was 1/6 of probably what they sold it to for someone else. So they've come to the table on that. Oh yeah. One other thing that I wanted to point out. So the university is our largest customer for all of our utilities. So they pay about 30 cents on the dollar for electric. So every dollar we bring in, 1/3 of it came from them. Same goes for water and sewer. Basically, they're hands down the largest customer. With stormwater, they are also our largest stormwater utility customer. On that side, it's actually closer to 40 cents on the dollar. So every dollar we bring in, 40 cents comes from them. So when we develop this property, it's going to be paid for back through the stormwater utility fee. So they're actually going to be paying for roughly 1/3 or more of the project costs for the project. So not only do they give us a pretty big discount, they're going to be paying for a large portion of this project. Yes, sir.
Their rates go up percentage-wise the same as the residents?
Everybody's will go up the same percentage, yeah. So if this goes through, everybody's rates are adjusted the same. So the way our rate structure is set up is the average house in the city is called an equivalent residential unit, and I think it's 1,620 square feet of impervious area is what an ESU, equivalent stormwater unit, is. So for residential properties, you fall into a tier, and each tier is either like 0.7 ERUs, 1 ERU, 1.5 and 2, something like that. If you're a commercial property, we take the total impervious area on your site and we divide it by 1,620 and get an equivalent. So it's like, say, 100 equivalent stormwater units for a commercial property, and then we multiply that by the same rate. So it's all linear. Everybody pays the same amount. Yeah. Yes, sir, in the back.
I'm pretty loud.
Okay.
Out here. For the pond that the Rodney proposal here, is there any scenario where, say we have a long dry spell, where we would have to pump water into the pond to keep wildlife alive or something like that?
So the question was, is there any scenario that during a drought we might have to supplement water? I'm going to stand over here. It's much quieter. So there's a chance, certainly. So right now the pipes, there are two very large pipes that come through the Rodney site, and they join together and go into a smaller pipe to go into the railroad, which is part of the reason why we have such flooding issues there. Those pipes do have some base flow where there's kind of always water running. We haven't monitored to know if it's always there, but it's always been there when I looked. So the pond will intercept the groundwater, but since there's some groundwater contamination, we're probably going to have a liner in it. So in this case, it'll probably be a type of clay, bentonite clay. They put a clay liner in, and that way, if the groundwater drops down, the water stays in. You'll lose it through evaporation. So if it was a long enough drought, there's a chance we might have to supplement some water, but it's hard to say at this point. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
On the other side, in a really torrential downpour, is the park going to flood then?
So the pond is designed to handle safely the 10-year storm, which is 5.2 inches of rain, 4.8 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. So right now, the design is the water level in the pond, so it'll have very gradual slopes. So every 3 feet, once you got down to the water, and actually the slope above it will be every 3 or 4 feet you go out, you'll drop down 1 foot. So it's relatively gentle slopes. And then once you're down in 1 foot of water, there's a 10-foot flat bench where it's totally level, and then the slope continues. But when it rains, that water level will rise up. So when you look at these plans that show where the water level is, let me go back and get to one. That. So let's say we have a 10-year storm or larger, the water might actually be all the way out here, up the bank some. But I think it's at full, it's 3 or 4 feet deeper than it currently. Yeah, so in one of those storms, it could only get about 3 to 4 feet deeper than it currently is. So it's not going to flood the whole property. It'll be contained to the pond. And if we had a storm that exceeded that 10-year storm event, like a Hurricane Floyd or some massive flood, there's an emergency spillway, so an area, one location where the water's designed to go that'll get it through to the underpass and out where it floods currently. Yes, sir.
If the university is gonna have another 4,000 grad students in it, would it be better to have apartments there? Where are they going to be living? I know that in Fairfield, there's an increasing number of students that are living in Southern California.
Yeah, so the question was, if the university is adding 4,000 grad students, wouldn't it be better to have apartments here? Well, that's a good question, and it's a question that I know our planning commission's been working on. We have a rental housing needs assessment that was completed a few years back that said even when the university was planning on zero growth, we needed to add 50 apartment units a year just to keep the same, basically, because that's how many more residents were coming that were looking to stay in apartments. So the Planning Commission, working with our Planning and Development Department and Council, have identified a few areas actually mostly on the east side of town, Chapel Street, Benny Street, Cleveland Avenue, where they're going to look to increase density. The one thing about this location is that it basically acts like a funnel. So you've got 70 acres of upstream drainage area that all funnels through that underpass and there's the one pipe there near the underpass. So it's a great bottleneck to put a pond here. It'll be much cheaper to do it here than it would be to do it anywhere else. It's also at the top of a drainage area that sees flooding all the way down. So we did some math on what it would cost to do this somewhere else and what would it take to get the same benefit. And it looked like in order to do what we're doing here on one property, we'd have to buy anywhere from 24 to 36 homes in Old Newark or in Devon, the Bins area, all in one area, demo the homes and build the pond there. Obviously that's not something that we could realistically do. Either condemnation, eminent domain, take them all, that's not going to happen. So it would be like a 30-year project. We have to wait for people to sell or convince them that they should sell. And that was north of $10 million just to do the bare bones eventual project. So we really think that this is a great location for the project and it's the best cost benefit out of the options that we've analyzed. We'll go over here because they've had their hands up for a while. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, this is a finance question. The $9 million that we've both been approved for?
Yes.
Okay, what happens if the referendum only passes to do the minimum of a park? Okay, do we lose the rest of that money or can we use it for other things?
No, we would lose that differential, and that would go back to the state for them to.
Okay, but we still get some of it.
Correct. So we were approved up to a cap of $9 million, and
Okay.
our project is estimated 8.1. So the state recommended a little buffer just because it's a special interest rate to go for an extra few $100,000 just to give us that space in case we needed it.
Because my fear is that Rodney dorms are full of asbestos and mold and all kinds of crap. So, because my kid lived there, so I know.
Yeah.
So, my fear is that that's just
No, that's.
a rising thing, and so.
We have had all the environmental investigation done. It is considered a brownfield because of the asbestos, and that's a reason that initial number is so high. It's also a building that I'm sure you're aware is made of block and concrete. You have to get rid of that somewhere. It's a lot to get rid of. The walls are 2 to 3 feet thick in some spaces. Maybe that's why they thought they didn't need air conditioning. I don't know. So either way, all that was taken into consideration in the $9 million number. So we have contingencies in there, and we have an actual plan for remediation for the asbestos and marginal amounts of other contaminants, but asbestos would be the larger. We also have the luxury of not having to do this over the summer. Obviously, costs for asbestos go up in the summer because that's when we do the schools. we have the luxury of getting their off-season. So we can bring costs down a little bit there. But again, there's contingencies in all these numbers.
Where does this all get dumped anyway?
Once it's clean, once it's remediated, it goes in some, usually where they take sand and dirt out of, they have to put something back. They put this type of material back. Some of it can even be recycled. I know a lot of the concrete that came out of the Star campus or Chrysler is being recycled and used as road base. So if that happens, then this number comes down further. But we can't guarantee that that's still going to happen, or that we're still going to have, a building, or construction boom at that time.
All right, Doug.
Look at all the water projects, and I know a few years ago you were doing a study on the dam for the water intake and options of maybe replacing that. And I didn't see it show up there. So where'd that all happen? And how's that working? All this other stuff.
Okay, so the question was, a few years back we had a relatively large project to rehab or replace the dam that is our surface water intake. So on the White Clay Creek, the old dam that was for the Curtis paper mill is actually the dam we use to divert water to our intake. So that dam is 260, 270 years old. It's extremely old. Following, I think it might have been, I'm trying to remember which hurricane it was, Irene, I think it was Hurricane Irene. We had water start to go around the dam during the storm, and we were concerned that we were going to lose the dam and it was going to fail because it's so old. So we had a relatively large project. I think it was about a little under $2 million that had been in the budget for a long time. And it was one of those ones where we never had the cash to do anything with it. It kept getting pushed out, kept getting pushed out. We eventually did get enough money to do an investigation of the dam and determine how stable it was and whether or not we needed to do rehab. And it was actually in a lot better shape than we thought. So the biggest risk to the dam is the stream going around it during a big storm, and that's something we can put back together relatively inexpensively. The other issue that we had is there were technically 5 dams on the White Clay Creek. Our dam was dam 5. There were more further north. They've since removed dam 1, which is all the way down at Delaware Park. There's a plan to remove dam 2, which is at Red Mill Road. And then dams 3, 4, and 5 are all the city of Newark. So there's American shad, hickory shad that come up the White Clay Creek, and those dams are prohibiting them from going any further. They removed the first one, the shad came further up. They're hopeful that the second one will bring them further up. So because it's no longer urgent for us to need to do a rehab or anything like that with the dam, we're going to wait. These other projects are a little more pressing. So get these projects out of the way, and hopefully by the time we're ready to talk about that project again, we'll have a lot more information about where the removal of those lower dams are and whether or not we should be removing or just rehabbing the dam, because there are some trains of thought that the shad won't come as far up as dam 5 anyway, so the largest ecological benefit may not actually make a difference. So the other thing was a concern about losing that dam was that's our largest source of water. But now that we have the reservoir, we have that shock absorber there. We can run off the reservoir. And having those wells, the layer track wells active, we can refill the reservoir even when the creek is down below the level where we have to turn off. So oddly enough, there are 3 surface water intakes, 3 water utilities with surface water intakes. City of Newark, City of Wilmington, and Suez Water. We're the only ones who have to turn ours off when the creek gets down too low because we're the last one and there are new environmental regulations in place now. So we have to turn off when the water gets below 14 million gallons a day, which ends up being probably half the summer, most summers, not right now because we've had so much rain. So when we're off the creek, that's when we have to go on the reservoir. So this gives us a way to fill the reservoir. We can put about 1.5 million gallons up with those wells while we're taking 3 million gallons a day out. So it really halves how much water we take out of the reservoir and doubles the amount of time that we can run off of it. So the reservoir lawsuit, if you remember back when that was going on, was actually due to interior slope stability. And one of the issues we have is that when the reservoir drains down below about 15, 16 feet down, it exposes soil that is that questionably stable soil that was the kind of the crux of that legal issue. So we have about 1/3 or maybe a little over 1/3 of the volume of the reservoir that's in that top part that we can use very easily. Once we get down below that, it gets a lot more expensive to use because we have to protect those interior slopes with tarps or some soil tackifiers to stabilize that interior slope. So by lengthening the amount of time we can work in that top half, it'll save us a lot of money if we have to go down in the lower half. Yes, ma'am.
The question is, what's the terms of these loans? How long are we going to be paying out money?
So the question is, what are the terms of the loan? So the loan for Rodney is 20 years, and I think 20 years is what we had used for all of the loans currently. So one thing that we haven't talked about yet is what happens in 5 years once we get through this 5-year CIP cycle. So all the projects we have proposed now are going to be done by 2022. So if you look at this, realistically, once we get out to 2022, we'll have finished all the projects that we currently have in the program. So we're going to have new projects that we need to do. Water mains, specifically on the water side, we'll have these water treatment plant projects out of the way. It'll be time to work on water mains, and we'll be focusing our spending on water mains. So over the next 5 years, as Star Campus comes online, we're going to have new revenues from there. We're looking at making modifications to our rate structure to try and level out the seasonal fluctuations we get. And so we can't say exactly what kind of revenue needs we're going to have in year 6 to be able to forecast out, but realistically, I think it's safe to say that we're probably going to be having a discussion about taking on more debt in year 6. Because if you look at the cash model, it's a little deceiving because it looks like once you get out to 2023, we're back down to nothing. But realistically, it's just going to be another set of projects doing that. And then you go 5 more years out and it'll be doing the same thing. So what our goal is, there should be some, we should have tools in our toolbox. We should have some debt use and some cash financing use. So in this case, you look at the 5 years, all 5 years we're going to spend at least that much. So our target once we get out into those out years is to get our rates so we have some level of cash that's covering the very consistent spending that's there year in, year out. And then we use debt to pick up these bumps like a shock absorber going down the road to level them out so they don't result in very large increases year over year.
20 years is a very long time, and more things are going to keep coming up, and my concern is our debt's going to keep bumping up.
I think and it will. I'm not going to tell you it's not going to. So as we get out further, we're going to be layering on more and more debt. But if we go the cash route, we're spending the same amount of money. So it'll just be kind of smoother and easier to use. So we mentioned, I said the same amount of money. Technically, you're spending more if you use debt because there's interest. But currently, right now, 2% interest is the Fed's target rate for inflation. So if we borrow at 2% and the inflation is actually 2%, it costs us nothing to borrow the money. But to compound off that is the state revolving loan funds programs, like this asset management incentive program, literally halves your interest rate. They're going to give you 50 cents of every dollar you pay in interest back to do asset management.
And that's not a grant, but people are thing?
It is a grant program, but you get into it with a 5-year commitment.
Depending on how the state has money, grants may not always come.
You get a 5-year locked in. So we're guaranteed at least 5 years once you get into the grant program. And that's a grant that we'll be working on the application shortly. So that's a good point. Not all grants are guaranteed, but the State Revolving Loan Fund program is one of the only programs of the EPA that I think actually has gotten stronger over the last 2 years with a renewed interest in spending more money at the federal level to the revolving loan fund programs. They actually added $300 million to this year's budget for the SRF program.
I'm also not sure if Dave pointed it out, but most of the design and preliminary work that we've done on the Rodney project and several of our other GIS system within the city have been paid for by these grants. So we've already been taking advantage of some of the matching planning grants and the planning advances for this referendum and for our GIS system to the tune of close to $1 million in grants over the last 5 years. So we're taking advantage of the program, and that's why they're on us all the time to say it gets better once you're actually in the program. So we certainly want to take advantage of some of that money.
Yes, sir.
The Star Campus appears to be something very beneficial for the city. Do you know of any projects that are not under construction now that are planned by the
So the question was, do I know of any projects that aren't under construction now that are planned for the Star Campus? I know of one, and they are doing a RFP. It's not out yet, but they'll be doing an RFP for a hotel and conference center at Star Campus, ideally near the train station. And I think their goal there is to have it open around when everything comes online, 2020. They also want to do, actually I guess I know more than one. I'm going to keep going. They also want to do a grad student village, so this comes to your conversation earlier, potentially up to 500 units of one and two bedroom grad student housing effectively near the train tracks. If you go to there's actually a website set up for the Star Campus, and they have a master plan for the whole campus. And you can go there, you can see the master plan, see what they have planned. They're almost planning, they don't know who's going in where, but they've got the street layout, they've got generally kind of it zoned, what they want to have in different locations. And you can get a feel for what they're proposing there. It's a really neat site. Yes, sir.
Back to the state revolving loan. So the $9 million for the Rodney project is essentially already approved, right? Or roughly there. But the question 3, stormwater, that funding is not approved, right? And that would be project by project.
Correct.
What's the risk level of them not approving individual projects? And if they didn't, would we then go to a bond funding for them?
That's a great question. So we've submitted kind of the initial round of applications called a notice of intent for all these projects, and they've all been accepted into the notice of intent program. So we feel confident that they like the projects, that they would fund the projects. But the issue we have is that it is a competitive program. So if we go in and a project like the Rehoboth Ocean Outfall, it's like a $35 million project comes through, there goes all the money, and we're out of luck until they get another capitalization grant from the EPA, and then there'll be money back the next year. So if that happens and we lose out to something that's a higher priority or that took all the money from the program that year, we could decide, do we want to wait a year or do we want to go the bond authorization route? I think which way we go depends on where we ran into that issue. So if we ran into the issue here at the front before we've taken out a bank loan or done too much, then all right, we're going to go the bond route. If it's in a later year, we're probably going to wait, I would think, and see if we can get in the next year and try and get together some money to patch something together to keep it going.
And we submitted applications for these 5 projects on the water side. And
Was it 1.3 million?
Governing Board, which is the Water Infrastructure Advisory Council, has already given preliminary approval to all the projects, including ours and several other municipalities, including Newcastle County, Town of Blades. I won't get into that one, but so they've already given the preliminary approval to the project list, and they asked for full applications, which we're working on now. So right now, it looks very, very good in our favor to get these projects approved.
Yep.
If I could, on the question 4, the $3 million, that I assume can't go through the state revolving loan because of the type of nature of those projects?
Correct.
So what's the decision making there in terms of why bond funding that smaller amount, that $3 million, versus doing the cash approach that we've always done? I mean, that seems like a different calculus than all these things go.
Yes, it was. So the reason why we're looking to do debt on these smaller projects is they're projects that have just never been able, they're the ones that just keep getting moved out year after year, and we don't have enough cash to do them. So if you look at our budget, it looks like we're sitting on about $27 million worth of cash. The problem is that's not really the whole story. So most of it actually is encumbered towards capital projects. So it's either already written out as a PO, or it's associated with a specific project, or it's in a specific fund. So we keep all of our utility funds separate. So water's here, electric's here, sewer's here. Most of it's in the electric fund. We can't move it to the water fund, for example, or it's associated with the cash that we need to keep on hand as an operating reserve requirement. There we go. Thank you, Dave. So we don't necessarily have reserves in the water fund. We actually have 0, almost negative reserves. Dave jokes because we've underperformed so much over the last few years that we've run through the reserves, so there's nothing left. So we really were looking at how do we reduce our cash requirements in a year or for the next few years to allow us to build reserves back up By reducing our cash requirements on the general fund side, we can transfer a little less out of the utilities and leave it in there to help build up the rainy day fund in our various utilities. And we talked a lot about spending. I didn't talk about what we've done to save money. So we've done a lot of work with council over the last few years to cut things out of the budget, reduce our budget. So we've converted our traditional pension system to a 401k style pension. So that started in 2012. So everyone hired at the city after 2012 in management, and I think it was 2014 or 2015 in our other unions, is now on a 401k style pension. I think it was about 3 years ago, we went up to Pennsylvania and got this group. It's the Delaware Valley Health Insurance Trust. It's a trust owned by about 200 or 300 municipalities, something like that, in Pennsylvania. And we brought them down into Delaware. We were the first person in Delaware to bring them down and became a partner in that. And that saved us 17% increases in renewals over the last 3 years alone.
In 1 year. So it's
Sorry.
45% cumulative.
45% over the last 3 years, 17% was in 1 year. We've also done early retirement incentive programs to try and get people that are here on the traditional pensions retired and get people hired at the bottom of the scale on the 401k style pensions. And those alone have saved in this year's budget $1.3 million just this year alone. So we've done a lot of work there. Since that budget was approved, we've done further attrition, targeted retirement incentives, and we've cut another $350,000 worth of salary. So we've been cutting a lot, and we're trying to attack it from both sides, but it's a big problem. So it takes some creative solutions. Yes.
Yeah, looking at the information about your life charts and curves, it looks like for the next 10 or 15 years, there's going to be a lot of an increase in maintenance. Because things are going to be failing and whatnot. And there's going to be a point where after about 10 or 15 years, maybe that's going to start leveling off because you'll be replacing stuff or retrofitting or whatever. But in the meanwhile, are you looking for any significant utility increase in taxes in addition to this over that period of time of any significance that's...
So the question was,
You're going to have more cost.
yeah, because we have this kind of wave of infrastructure replacement coming towards us that's going to exceed what we're doing here today. What are we going to do? Are we going to be raising rates, or are we going to be doing looking for additional revenue? The answer is yes. We're probably going to be looking for additional revenue. How we get that revenue is still an open question. So I guess it was last week now, Dave and I and Mark Rainer in the back were down in Dover promoting a charter amendment for the city of Newark that would give us the ability to charge a lodging tax. So believe it or not, the city of Newark has 1,000 hotel rooms. The state has the ability to charge a lodging tax. They charge 8%. Wilmington, by state law, can charge up to 3%, and a bunch of beach towns, almost all the beach towns, have the ability to charge a lodging tax. We don't. So we are asking the state legislature to give us the ability to charge up to 3% lodging tax, which is going to bring in revenue, assuming it passes. So it's through the House all the way, and it's through Senate committee, and it's out to the full Senate. That is the equivalent of a 10% tax increase that we'll be able to avoid by going this lodging tax route. We're also looking at putting in place impact fees and capital cost recovery charges. So when a new development project comes into Newark, we require them to pay for 100% of any capacity upgrades that have to happen to a company to be able to serve that project. But if a project doesn't require a capacity upgrade, they're just using capacity that exists, it doesn't cost them anything. But there's a cost to the city for that because we're giving up capacity that we have today. So we're looking at adding impact fees. So let's say you connect, or let's use Star Campus as a relevant one. Right now, we don't have the capacity electric-wise to serve the second half of the demand that's going to come at Star Campus. So we can serve the first half, about 30 megawatts of demand we'll be able to serve. But the second 30, we can't serve with our existing infrastructure. So once we get out to 30, we're going to have to bring in another feed from Delmarva and build a new substation. And the university has actually already given us the land at Star Campus to do that. Or they pledged the land, technically, we don't own it. So we know that there's going to be this $10 million project coming once we've built out 30 megawatts of demand down there. So we can take $10 million divided by 30 megawatts and charge you a set amount when you come in. Okay, I'm 2 megawatts of demand, so you're going to get 1/15 of that $10 million cost. So we're looking at developing those. We're going to be working with council to develop them over the next year probably, to try and diversify our revenue sources without making our current customers pay for growth. We don't want to make you guys pay for growth. We want the people that are growing to pay for the growth. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of growth, I mean, we talked about the 4,000 people, the graduate students, et cetera, and all the other demands that are going to be placed because they're going to build apartments, et cetera. Speaking of building the new power plant, I mean, has that been thought into, do you know what the increments are going to increase each year so that you can plan for what drain it's going to be on us?
So we won't be building any power plants, fortunately, or at least not directly. But yes, the projects that we have, well, there was the issue at Star Campus. The water plant projects that we're creating, that we're doing with here, will increase our capacity, our ability to take on additional growth. And the way we're going to pay for those is through a capital cost recovery charge. So we're paying for it now, and as someone comes online, they're going to pay us back for what we already paid. Impact fee pays for things that you're going to build in the future. Capital cost recovery pays for things that you've already done. On the electric side, we get our power on the market. So we're part of the Delaware Municipal Electric Corporation. And it's us and 7 other municipalities that own it. And it's a joint power agency. So we work together and we go to the market together and we use our combined buying power to get better rates on the market. So as projects come on, they're going to come on over time, and we'll be able to buy futures contracts, out a few years to kind of add on the supply. So electric is before a year ago, I hadn't really been too involved in it. It's extremely complicated, but we have specialists at DMAC that work for us that take care of all those purchases, and they feel very confident that they'll be able to absorb that demand without having, actually have a benefit from Newark. Because a bigger pool, any variation is a smaller fraction of that larger number. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if it's appropriate to ask this question yet, but if this referendum passes, we're talking, in my mind anyway, about an enormous amount of money. And so who will have oversight over that money, and then who has oversight over the construction part of it to see that they do what the town of Newark wants them to do and that we don't wind up with lawsuits?
Okay, so the question was, it's a lot of money. Who has oversight over the money and who has oversight over the construction? So ultimately, the people with oversight over everything are in the back of the room, our council people. So they, any spending above $25,000 has to be directly approved by council. So once we'll develop the project, we being staff. Most of these projects are in the Public Works and Water Resources Department, so it'll be Tim and I and our staff, once I get back there, doing most of these projects. We have a fleet of inspectors. We have engineering consultants that work for us. Both Tim and I are licensed engineers in the state of Delaware. So we will be doing the construction oversight and project management for the projects, either ourselves or through one of our consultants. And then we report back up to our elected officials who control the purse strings with those projects.
Do these kinds of things require specialized engineering knowledge?
So most of them, the specialized knowledge is what we have. So I would say of the projects in here that are maybe beyond our specialization is the actual treatment plant design, because we don't, we operate, we don't do treatment plant design. So on our treatment plant design projects, we're working with AECOM. It's the largest engineering firm in the world, and they're doing the design for or at least they're currently doing the design for those projects. The other aspect, I would say the environmental remediation portion of Rodney. We've partnered with Johnson, Muir, Moran, and Thompson, and they're using Brightfields as their environmental consultants. So we're partnering with specialists to handle the specialist portions. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Jason. We'll wrap up. We'll stick around for questions afterwards. If anyone had anything they didn't feel comfortable asking in front of the group, we'll be here for a while. And thank you for coming out.
I just wanted to say thank you to the staff. As you guys saw, that's a pretty comprehensive presentation with a lot of detail, and I know I've learned a lot through this process, and I think we're lucky to have such a talented group that can handle such a complex issue and present us with the choice of solutions that can put us in the best position moving forward. So I'll also be hanging around if you have questions about this or just related to other things going on in the city that you wanted to talk about. I know the development thing came up. That's a hot topic and a big topic that council and many people throughout the city have been spending time on. So I have a lot of opinions about that, and I'm free to talk about that if you'd like to. So thanks for coming out, and have a good night.
Thank you.